Hello and welcome to another LeetCode video. So I think what I decided is I'm going to do the JavaScript 30-day challenge, probably like a problem a day or something. But instead of like, a lot of these problems are pretty straightforward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a bunch of different things you can do in the problem and things that you can take away to actually learn JavaScript. And then we're going to apply those to the tougher problems. And then I might do something like a blind 75 in JavaScript after. But so for this problem, actually, all it's asking is to return a function that prints hello world. And so if you actually look at it, this runs already, but I'm going to discuss like all the different things you can do. Okay, so let's start off discussing what this args means. And so what this args means is it's called a rest parameter, and pretty much what it does is input in a function will be passed in, and let's say you don't know how many arguments you have. Like you're making a function, you don't know how many arguments you have. So you can just have arguments like, this function can be called with like, whatever, first, second, third, and so on. And so if you don't know how many arguments your function is actually going to take, you can do this. And then what this will do is this will read all the arguments. And the way to access these is if you do something like this and like this. If you just call args, then args will be the array of all of these functions that were called in. And so you could do it like this. And the nice thing about it is, yeah, like if you don't know how many functions your method takes, or sorry, if you don't know how many parameters your method takes, you can use this args, and then you can loop through your args by accessing the args variable. Like I said, an args will just be an array. So it'll take all of the parameters and it'll turn them into an array. And then you can even call another function, and if you want to pass those same args again, you can do this as well. So you can call some other function with these args, and it will take that array args and spread it out into multiple parameters. So that's the first thing I want to discuss. The next thing I wanted to discuss is other ways we can do this, right? So what is this actually doing? So const create hello world is a variable, and so I think this was actually var. But typically what you want to be using is you want to be using const or let. I don't think var is used very often. So you want to use const when you're making something that's immutable. And so you can use const for functions, you can use const for objects, because you are going to be like changing the object itself, but you're not going to be changing where in memory the object is stored. So you can use const for arrays or for just constant integers and things, that you aren't going to be changing in the future. Okay. And so what this function does is it returns another function that takes some arguments and returns hello world. Another difference in JavaScript compared to Python is if you have a function that takes some arguments, right, like 1, 2, 3, and you call that function. So let's say this function does something, and you call that function. So if you just say, like, let's call function, and you give it some arguments, a couple things can happen. So if you give it too few arguments in Python and in some other more strict languages, this will give you an error. So if your function accepts 3 arguments, but you only give it 2, this will give you an error, but in JavaScript, it actually won't. And so what's going to happen is every single parameter that the function takes, if it's not passed in, it will default to undefined. So like in this case, let's say this is like, the first argument, the second argument, the third argument, or let's just say 1, 2, 3, right? So what this will do is if you call it like this 3 will actually equal undefined. And so that's one way you could test if you have the right number of arguments passed into your function. And then, so this is if you give it too few, and if you give it too many, what's actually going to happen is JavaScript will only read the ones that it needs. So if you give it too many, it'll still work. And this 1, 2, 3 will be these 1, 2, 3. And if you give it too few, the ones that you didn't give will be undefined. And the other thing you can do is if you want to have initial values just in Python, you can give it some initial value. So you can say like 3 equals, 3 or whatever. And so if something's not passed in, then it'll have an initial value just like in Python. Okay, so that's the number of arguments that I wanted to go over. Now, also another thing in JavaScript is semicolons are the standard, but they're not required. So if you have this or this, it'll still work. There are some specific errors that you can get by not having semicolons, and that's where they're like the standard. So I do like it's considered best practice that you are going to want to use semicolons, but they're not required. And so if we actually look at how this function is called, so what by the way, so what this whole thing does is so this create hello world is a function that returns another function. So when a function returns another function, really const hello world is actually really gonna equal this. Like it's gonna make this function return it, and really what it's gonna be is this inner function. So it's actually going to be something like that. And so I think obviously if you run it like this will work. Well, you do need to create hello world, but that's pretty much what it's doing like behind the scenes. Okay, so that's one thing. Now another thing, well, so if you look how it's actually called, so it's saying constant F create hello world, and so create hello world will actually make like this create hello world will actually make this function. So constant F will equal this right here. Okay, and so the reason it's not going to work. The reason it's not going to work if I just delete this, because we are actually calling the function and we do need to set it to that. But as you can notice, create hello world, it is used, like it is like create hello world does make this function, but when you actually call this function, it doesn't take any parameters. So if we get rid of this, like we don't actually need any arguments for this function. So this should still work. Yeah. And I think there's like only one test case anyway. So like if this works, then the whole thing works. But anyway, so if you don't need to give it arguments, you can give it this. But if it doesn't need to take, like if you don't, like I said, if you don't know how many arguments you want to give it, you can do this. And then if it doesn't take any arguments, it'll just not use it. So it'll take these arguments, but even if there's nothing, it's not going to use any of it, so it doesn't matter. Okay, so that's one thing you could do. There's a couple other things you can do, and let's show some of those. So for one thing, what you can do is you can actually make a function and then return it. So you could say something like const func equals this, and then we can actually return func. I believe that'll work. Let's test it though. Yeah, so that works as well, but like I said, the return is a shorthand. Now there are a couple other things that I wanted to show. So another thing we can do is, so we did return a function. Now the other way you can actually write this is in the arrow notation, and the arrow notation is pretty straightforward. So you have this like left and right bracket, which takes in some input, and then you have this arrow. And it's also an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name, but not necessarily, not all arrow functions are anonymous functions. An anonymous function is just a function without a name. So here we're returning straight away, which means it would be. And then, so the typical format for an arrow function is you have some inputs, you have an arrow, and then you just have the actual function. And so this should work. But also what you can do is, because this create hello world is so short, you can just, if you want to return on the same line that you made the function, you can actually do something like this and you don't even need the return. And so let's try that, and that works as well. Now let's actually go to the LeetCode one. So what we can actually do here is, because we're making a function, we can actually do this. And I'll explain this in a second. So we can literally do this. And that passes too. So what we're saying is create hello world is a function. So it's this first thing is a function that that takes in no input, and then it returns another function that writes hello world. So this would be the shorthand way of writing, like the shortest way possible. Okay, so I wanted to go over that, and then one more thing, and then we're going to be done here. So let's actually go to the original way. And we are going to discuss closures. So let me just make sure this works. Okay. So what closures are is, because we're returning another function, this returned function is going to have access to all of the inputs of the function it was made out of and all of the variables that were made in it. So what we can actually do is we can create a hello world. So we can say const like h or something equals hello world. And then we can actually just return h here. And that's because since we made a function inside another function, this function is going to have access to this h. And then if this had some other parameters, like if it had some other parameters like args, this return function has access to all of these args. You can access them, you can modify them, and the function will remember if they were modified. So for example, if I said constant h equals hello world, and then I had like some other variable in here, like let number equals 1, and I did something like in this function, I would say number plus plus, number plus plus, okay, and I actually console log this. So it's console.log number, and then let's return h, and let's actually call this like, so we can just say this, I believe, so constant f, and then we can just say like f a bunch of times. So let's see what this will actually do. Okay, let's see. Hopefully this lets you print. Yeah, so you can see here that, so what we did is we made this function f, which is this inner function. And now in this inner function, we are actually incrementing number, but number isn't even in our function. It's in the upper function. So we can see we increment it to 2, and then we keep incrementing it. And then if you make, here's the other cool thing about this is if you make if you do this again, you make a new one, and now you print h, look what happens. So this last 2 is actually from calling, like this is from actually calling the the built-in tests in LeetCode, but ignoring this last 2, this is our code that we wrote. So we have f, so it increments number every time and prints it to 2, 3, 4, 5. But then you can see that once we make this h doesn't remember what number was. And so for every time you make an instance of this function, for every time you make a new one, these variables will be reset. So it's really nice because you can have a bunch of instances of one function, and then that function has its own variables that you can actually reuse. So this is like really useful in JavaScript, and this is something you should know. Okay, so that's closures, and I think that's everything I wanted to cover in this video. So hopefully that was helpful for you. There are some other things that they talked about for this problem, but I don't think they're relevant to this problem, so I'm not going to cover them here. I'll cover them in the next video. But if you liked it, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know what you think about these types of videos, and I'll probably make more JavaScript. I'm just going to do the 30-day challenge, like a problem a day or something, and post those. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.